Imagine this, an ordinary school morning. Children with backpacks and smiles get on the bus, expecting nothing bad. But suddenly something happens that makes the blood run cold. The driver, with a scowl on his face, full of obvious hatred, looks at one of the girls and tells her to get off. Yes, just because she's black. He forces her off the bus in the middle of the route, leaving her standing on the side of the road, where no one knows what might happen next. Every parent, every child could have been in her shoes. Who would have thought such scenes were still possible today? The driver could not have imagined the consequences of what he did. The reaction of the community, the school, and even the city authorities exceeded all expectations, signaling that indifference is unacceptable. It is very important for us to know what you would do if you were an eyewitness. Write in the comments what your name is and from what city or country you are watching this video. You are our support, our strength. It is you, our viewers, who help promote this channel and do not let us forget about such injustices. We are grateful to each of you, and your opinion is very valuable to us. Thank you for staying with us and helping us in our fight for justice and equality. These words set up an emotional response, reinforcing the audience's sense of importance and gratitude, creating a close connection with the audience. The early morning was clear and cool. There was a fresh smell in the air, as if nature itself wanted to help the school children as they looked forward to the start of the day. A fine morning fog was still blowing over the road, and the bright light of the rising sun was slowly dispersing it. The air tingled with light excitement and muffled conversations. Children with backpacks were waiting for the school bus, talking among themselves, joking, sometimes yawning, not yet fully awake. Every morning, the bus arrived at the same stop, picking up children on their way to school. Some of them were still standing sleepy and quiet, while others were laughing, recounting the events of the previous weekend, or discussing the upcoming lessons. The children's ringing voices filled the atmosphere like music, setting the tune of a normal school day. Parents, some with a cup of morning coffee and some just standing around, watched the children board the bus. They smiled and looked at each other, saying a brief good morning to each other as they got ready to go home or to work. There was a calmness on each of their faces. The morning, as always, was predictable, measured, and safe. When the bus appeared, the children turned their heads with interest, and some even waved to the driver, waiting for his friendly nod. The bus doors opened with a distinctive hiss, and one by one the school children began to step inside. Among them was Kira, a 7th grader who usually sat closer to the middle of the bus. She smiled welcomingly at her friends, and as always, looked for a window seat. The bus seemed like a safe island where the children could relax before class and discuss their petty joys and worries. No one could have guessed that an ordinary morning would soon turn into a real storm of events that would shake not only these school children, but the whole community around them. When Kira reached the steps of the bus, her joyful smile faded slightly. The driver, whom she had barely noticed before, was staring at her, a polite and calm man who always nodded indifferently to every child who jumped aboard excitedly. But this time his gaze was different. This new driver looked sullen, with his lips tightly pressed together and a direct, penetrating gaze that held a cold dislike. When Kira climbed the first step, his eyes seemed to burn through her. There was not a shadow of warmth in them, only a heavy expression of squeamishness and disdain. He looked at her as if her presence were something dirty, something he wanted to get rid of as soon as possible. For a second, which seemed like an eternity, the driver kept his eyes on her. He narrowed them, as if assessing her with displeasure and even irritation, as if Kira had disturbed some of his inner peace with her appearance. His gaze spoke volumes. It was as if he were telling her that she was not welcome here, that her presence on this bus was unpleasant and inappropriate for him. Kira felt a chill run down her spine, her heart beating a little faster. It wasn't the usual adult-on-child stare. There was something alien, unpleasant, even threatening about it. He squinted and pulled back slightly, as if he feared that the girl, by taking another step, might violate some private space she had no right to enter. The other children began to climb onto the bus after her, but the driver didn't look at them. His hostile gaze was directed solely at Kira. Every step she took inside the bus seemed to make him more and more disgusted. He paused for a moment before pressing the button and closing the doors, once more casting a disparaging glance at her, as if to let her know that he had let her in reluctantly, only because he was obliged to do so. As soon as Kira found a free seat and sat down, there was silence in the cabin, which was cut through by the driver's heavy voice. As soon as the bus started and moved off, he muttered without turning around, "Well, look who's here. We've got an important person here. Does she think the whole bus is the same color?" The words sounded loud and deliberate, as if he wanted every child in the cabin to hear his every phrase. Kira realized the words were addressed to her, and her insides clenched. She felt the eyes of the other children turn to her, some bewildered and some frightened. She tried to concentrate on the scenery outside the window, but the driver's stream of hostility continued unabated. She tried to focus on the scenery, but the flow of hostility from the driver didn't stop. "Well, we have a special passenger on board today," he said, emphasizing the word special, as if she were alien, different from everyone else. "I hope we all have enough air." Some of the younger children didn't understand what he was getting at, but others felt uncomfortable and began to whisper nervously. Kira squirmed, feeling a chill of shame and humiliation run down her spine. Her face flamed, and she wanted to disappear, to be invisible, to avoid that burning gaze. The driver continued with a note of caustic sarcasm. "You know, when I started out, I never thought I'd have to drive such passengers. It's hard to get used to being besieged with dirt. It stinks, you know." He purposely said the last phrase loudly, practically shouting it, making the other children shudder. One boy giggled quietly, clearly not understanding what was happening, but most of the children sat tense, clearly not knowing how to react. They were scared, whether from the sudden display of hatred from an adult, or from the fact that what was happening was about their friend, and they intuitively sensed that this wasn't just a joke. Kira felt crushed, her heart thudding and her hands trembling slightly. She realized that every comment he made was directed at her, even though he never once called her by name. He spoke of her as if she were something that had gotten on the bus by accident, an unwanted obstacle in his path. With each new remark he made, her gaze lowered to the floor. A heavy, suffocating sense of shame was building in her chest, and tears began to well up in her eyes, but she tried hard not to cry, not to give him pleasure, knowing that he was probably enjoying her humiliation. Passing another neighborhood, the driver suddenly threw, "Why don't we just drop her off here? Let her walk instead of ruining the air for all of us." He deliberately raised one eyebrow, looking in the rearview mirror to track the reaction. A few of the kids recoiled fearfully, and Kira felt panic overwhelm her. She was afraid that he would actually do it, that he would leave her alone on the road. Her thoughts were racing, and she tried to think of what to say or how to defend herself, but her mind was blank. She felt that even if she tried to object, it would only invite another torrent of insults. The driver grinned, and his eyes met hers for a moment in the mirror. He looked at her as if she were the enemy, as if she were nothing, as if she didn't deserve to be on that bus. Her situation was desperate, but none of the kids dared to say anything. No one defended her, and she felt like she was completely alone. Her fingers gripped the straps of her backpack tightly, and she stared out the window, trying to drown out everything he said. But his words penetrated her consciousness, making her feel worse and worse. She knew that this far, this man could go more than once, and all she had to do was wait for the bus to stop at the school. But every moment until that stop was an ordeal, and every word he said hurt her deeper. As Kira tried to forget the derogatory remarks and caustic glances the driver threw her through the mirror, the bus slowed abruptly at another stop. The doors opened with a clang, and a few more students entered. They amicably, as if pushed by an invisible force, walked past Kira, taking the empty seats. She cautiously stood up to find a new seat, but she had no sooner taken a step than she heard the sharp, cold voice of the driver. "Stop," he growled, turning toward her this time. His tone was commanding, as if he were commanding someone beneath him. "Where do you think you're going?" Kira, confused and caught off guard, froze in place. She didn't know what to say, but the driver grinned and pointed his finger at the empty seat next to her, where she was about to sit. "You think this is the place for you?" His voice oozed contempt. "Stay away. You're not supposed to sit here." These words stunned Kira. She didn't understand what could have caused such an attitude, why he was literally chasing her away from every free seat. She stared at him, confused, not knowing what to do. Her heart was pounding so hard that she could almost hear its hum echoing in her ears. There was an oppressive silence in the cabin. The other children, not daring to intervene, watched silently. Some of them furtively exchanged anxious glances, not understanding why the driver, an adult and responsible person, was being so cruel to their classmate. But no one dared to say a word. "Come on, move," he ordered her, waving his hand impatiently as Kira tried again to move to another spot. "These seats aren't for people like you. You think you deserve to sit with the rest of us? You'll be standing." She looked at the other children again, as if seeking support, but their eyes were staring away or downcast. She was overcome with bitterness. They were her friends, and she thought someone would at least give her a look of support, but there was only silence. The feeling of loneliness grew stronger, as if she were suddenly an outcast among those she considered her peers. The girl tried to object again, hoping to at least explain that her leg hurt, but barely had she opened her mouth when the driver interrupted her again. "Oh, you're going to talk too?" He threw venomously, not letting her say a word. "I said stop, and don't you dare object. You see the kids here? They don't deserve to sit next to people like you." His words, spoken with contempt and blatant racism, cut to the core. She lowered her head in silence, feeling tears come to her eyes. She was being forced to stand, as if she wasn't even entitled to a regular seat, as if her presence was something vicious. There was such contempt in his voice that she felt as if she were something alien, something unworthy of even simple respect. Passengers kept coming in at stops, and every time a free seat appeared, the driver kept a close eye on Kira. As soon as she made an attempt to sit down, his voice instantly sounded like a command. "Don't you dare sit down! I told you, it's not for you." The children in the cabin felt the growing tension and tried not to look at Kira, trying not to attract the driver's attention. Some of them were afraid that if they tried to support her, the driver would unleash the same torrent of hatred on them. The bus, which used to be a place of fellowship and joy, had turned into a cramped box filled with fear and a pressurized atmosphere. With each new stop, Kira grew more and more tired of standing. Her legs began to ache, but she silently endured, afraid that any word might lead to an even more humiliating attack. Every attempt to rest on the back of the seat ended with the driver's sharp shouts. "Don't you dare touch me! I don't want you messing up the seats." The words were like blows, and each phrase cut into her mind, leaving deep scars of humiliation and resentment. She felt like she was cornered, deprived of the right to basic respect and dignity. The bus went on, swaying monotonously over the bumps, but for Kira, every movement was agonizing. She stood, clinging to the handrail as hard as she could to keep her balance, but fatigue and fear were making themselves felt. Her legs were beginning to whine and her back was stiff from the strain. Still, she stood silent, afraid of arousing more scorn and anger from the driver. But his patience was wearing thin. As he passed another stop, he abruptly turned off the route and slowed down. Kira felt the bus slow down and her heart sank. She looked out the window and realized that this place wasn't a stop or even any kind of safe stretch of road, just a deserted, scrubby patch of roadside. The driver sighed loudly, as if his patience had finally broken, and his voice pierced the silence. "That's enough," he said with icy anger. "I don't think you realize you don't belong here." Kira looked up at him in panic, but before she could utter a word, he leaned toward her and hissed through his teeth, "You disobey my orders again, and you'll walk right out of here. Do you understand? Or do you think you're so special that you have some kind of privilege?" His gaze flashed with cruel mockery. He looked at her as if she, the little schoolgirl, was to blame for all his problems, and he only had to find a reason to vent his anger on her. Kira didn't know what to say. She was seized with dread. She knew that if he did drop her off, she would be alone in the middle of the road, without any help, and the fear paralyzed her. She tried to swallow the lump lodged in her throat, but his words continued to echo in her ears like a sentence. "Are you deaf?" he growled, raising his voice so that all the children in the cabin could hear him. I said, "If you don't want to drive by my rules, get out of here. You think I enjoy looking at you standing there, miserable and out of place?" She tried to take a step back, as if hoping to escape his gaze, but he only grinned evilly, noticing her consternation. "Oh, scared?" he said with an obvious sneer. "You're not so brave anymore, are you? You think I'm kidding? I'll open the door and no one will know where you've gone. In your case, it's for the best. Think of it as a lesson in how to behave where you're not wanted." The children on the bus looked at each other again. A few stared fearfully at the driver, some trying not to look at Kira so as not to draw attention to themselves, and others sitting in confusion, afraid to say a word. Fear was evident in their gazes, fear of an adult who could humiliate them the way he was humiliating her now. Kira felt panic overwhelm her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she struggled to hold back. She realized that any word or movement would be even more humiliating for her, but the driver, noticing her distressed state, seemed even more angry. "Oh, so you've decided to keep your mouth shut? You think I can't see you standing there, playing the victim? It won't help you. You think if you don't say anything, I'll feel sorry for you?" His voice was getting louder and harder. "You should be thankful you let me on the bus at all." Then he glanced at the rearview mirror again, checking the other kids' reactions. He was clearly savoring their silent fear, realizing that they were now as afraid of him as Kira was. He turned sharply toward her again, enunciating each word with menace. "I have only one rule on this bus. Obey. You either obey or you're out." He slowly reached for the door button, as if savoring every moment, seeing Kira tense up, expecting the worst. The bus stopped again, and the driver opened the door as if showing her the way out. "Come on," he said threateningly. "You're not welcome here." Those words were the last straw. She stood there, unmoving, unable to comprehend that a grown man could say such a thing to a schoolboy. Her fear, humiliation, and anger seemed to intertwine into a single weight that squeezed her chest. The bus stopped with a sudden jerk in the middle of the deserted road, framed only by trees and tall grass. The doors rattled open, and the cold morning air rushed into the cabin, bringing with it a sense of unsettling emptiness. The driver turned to Kira and, squinting his eyes, said with unspeakable contempt, "Get out! This is where you belong." Kira froze, unable to believe her ears. The children in the cabin were staring breathlessly at the driver and at her, some dumbfounded, some with silent fear. The girl clutched at the handrail, not knowing how to react, but her protests, silent and trembling, only inflamed him more. "I said get out," his voice sounded like an order. "Or do you think there's room for you on this bus? You're not wanted here. Everyone else understands that. You don't seem to." Kira felt everything inside her turn upside down. She whispered softly, almost pleading, "Please don't leave me here. I just want to get to school." Her words elicited only a contemptuous chuckle from the driver. He leaned closer and his face became even harder, almost cruel. "You don't belong at school either. Did you even think you could ride here with the others?" He emphasized the word, "the others," giving her a look of squeamishness, as if she were something inferior, something that shouldn't be around the other kids. "You thought they'd let you do that just because someone decided everyone had the same rights?" "Well, no." Kira shook her head, not knowing what to say, tears rolling down her cheeks. But the driver remained adamant. He enjoyed her humiliation, her despair, as if he enjoyed watching a child fighting in terror for the right to stay in the warmth and safety of the bus. "You remember," he said, with a cold, hard grin. "People like you don't deserve to ride with the other kids. You'll ruin the air, disrupt the order. There's no place for them here." His words, spoken with venom and racist hatred, sounded like a sentence to Kira. She looked at him pleadingly once more, hoping that he would come to his senses, that this was all a cruel joke. But the driver, without blinking, looked directly into her eyes, as if enjoying every tear she shed, every manifestation of her fear and despair. He shook his head slightly toward the exit, letting her know she had no choice. "If you don't come out now," he said with an obvious threat, "I'll make you come out. But only then will you wish you'd done it the nice way." The words sounded like a cold order, final and irrevocable. He waved his hand, pointing to the empty, deserted road. She thought for a second that one of the children would stand up for her, that someone would tell the driver to stop. But there was silence, as if nature itself did not dare to disturb this terrible scene. Realizing that it was pointless to resist, Kira slowly stood up, feeling her legs shaking with fear and shame. She took a step toward the exit, and when she was on the first step, the driver shoved her forward, forcing her to get out faster. She staggered but kept her footing and found herself on the cold pavement as she went down. A gust of cold wind blew across her face, and at that moment it became clear to her that she was alone. She turned around to look at the driver and try to see if he had changed his mind, but his face remained adamant. He looked at her with such disdain, as if she was dirt he had to shake out of the bus. Without waiting for a word in her defense, the driver slammed the door in her face, and with a loud jerk, the bus moved off, leaving her behind in a cloud of dust and exhaust. Kira stood alone on the empty road, staring after the departing bus that was carrying away her classmates, her friends, her normal world from which she had been so cruelly banished. She shook with fear and cold, feeling the tears rolling down her cheeks, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. There was a heavy, oppressive silence in the bus cabin. The children who a moment ago had been acting as usual, laughing, whispering, leafing through their textbooks, now sat frozen, stunned by what had just happened. The noise of the engine and the quiet rustle of tires on the road seemed to be the only sounds, and each child stared ahead, trying not to meet the eyes of either the driver or each other. They were immersed in confusion and fear. For them, something important had just collapsed, as if their familiar and safe world had cracked. They knew that adults were always the protectors, the ones they could trust. But now, there was an adult sitting in front of them who had acted so cruelly, mercilessly throwing their classmate out on the road. Some of them were stunned, others tried to comprehend what was happening, but they all felt the same cold fear. The girl in the front seat was still staring out the window where Kira had just stood, as if unable to believe that her friend had really been left alone on the side of the road. Her fingers clutched the strap of her backpack tightly, her hands white with tension. The boy beside her murmured softly, This can't be true, can it? He couldn't just kick her out, could he?" His words, though spoken almost in a whisper, sounded louder than the noise of the engine. The other children looked at each other, but no one dared to answer. The driver, as if sensing the wave of fear that washed over the cabin, cast a cold glance at them in the rearview mirror, and they immediately averted their eyes, as if hoping he would not notice their confusion. The little boy in the back seat sobbed, and his friend tugged gently on his sleeve, trying to comfort him. Even the kids who hadn't known Kira intimately before felt guilty. They had done nothing to protect her, to stand by her side, and that realization increased their anxiety and fear. But what scared them the most was that there was nothing they could do. They had seen what this adult was capable of, and each of them feared that now the same fate might befall them. Another girl who used to be on close terms with Kira cautiously pressed herself against the window and quietly asked her friend, Why did he do that? She didn't do anything wrong, did she?" Her friend, looking away, only nodded nervously, trying to cope with the growing lump of fear. No one wanted to attract the attention of the driver, who seemed to have become in their eyes an evil being, dangerous and unpredictable. He seemed to them not just an adult, but an intimidating and frightening figure, the source of the unknown threat they had to face. Some of the children tried to hide behind the backs of the seats so that the driver would not see their faces and the fear that was reflected in their eyes. It seemed that each of his cold and evaluating gazes only increased their anxiety. They began to realize that they had nowhere to run in this confined space, and each of them was afraid deep down that they might become the next victim. "Don't say anything," one of the boys whispered to his friend when he tried to say something. "If he sees us talking, he might get angry." These words had the effect of an ice shower on the children. They realized that they must now remain quiet and inconspicuous. The driver, in their opinion, was capable of anything, and they silently wallowed in their anxiety, feeling their childlike security shattered. Kira stood at the edge of the road, surrounded by silence and loneliness. The cold morning wind blew against her face, making her shiver not only from the low temperature, but also from the fear that gripped her whole body. The bus disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a cloud of dust, and Kira realized clearly that she was now all alone, left in the middle of an unfamiliar terrain where there was no familiar face, no help. She took a step back, feeling the soft grass of the roadside crumple beneath her shoes, and looked around, trying to find some sort of landmark. But there was only a deserted stretch of road, a long strip of asphalt surrounded by sparse trees and bushes, and the outline of hills somewhere in the distance. Kira tried to see where she was, but every tree and bush looked the same, as if merged into a monotonous picture of hopelessness. Her heart was pounding frantically in her chest. She felt tears coming to her eyes again, but she tried to keep them back, holding herself back, because tears would not get her out of here. She realized that at this early hour no one would be passing through here, away from the city streets. Few people would want to travel this road, and help might not come for a long time. She tried to remember the way to school, imagining she could walk, but she was overcome with a feeling of utter helplessness. She had no idea where exactly she was, and all the roads seemed the same. Her thoughts flitted from one panicky idea to another, but none of them were sure to lead her to salvation. Then a thought flashed through her mind. What if we go back? Maybe she could catch up with the bus. Maybe it would stop if she tried to run. But looking into the distance, where the bus had already disappeared around the corner, Kira realized it was useless. The driver had done this on purpose. He wasn't going to wait for her. He wanted to leave her here, alone, helpless, and scared. A lump of despair squeezed her chest as she realized that she had been literally thrown away, like something unwanted and unwanted. For a moment she wanted to scream, to call for help, but her voice was lost in fear. She was afraid that even if someone heard her, it would not be someone who could help her, but perhaps someone else who was strange and dangerous. She didn't know who might be in the wilderness, and that thought only made her more anxious. Every breeze made her flinch. Every rustle seemed to be a threat. She hunched her shoulders, clutching the straps of her backpack as if trying to make herself as small and invisible as possible. The driver's words echoed in her head, as if predicting that she didn't belong here, that she didn't deserve to be with the other kids. Those words sounded like a judgment, and every time she remembered them, the fear gripped her even more. She tried to push away the thought that someone might have left her here on purpose, but those doubts filled her soul with worry and dread. The minutes dragged on endlessly, each one filled with pain and fear of the unknown. Her eyes darted around, hoping to see at least one silhouette, at least one car, at least one person who could help her. But there was nothing but emptiness. It was several minutes before the first car appeared on the deserted road. Kira stepped forward hopefully, raising a trembling hand to attract the driver's attention. The car slowed down, and a middle-aged woman opened her window slightly and looked at the girl standing alone on the curb with surprise and concern. "Honey, what are you doing here?" she asked worriedly, looking at Kira's frightened face and tear-stained eyes. Kira, still panic-stricken, tried to explain that she had been left here alone, but the emotion she felt made it hard to speak. The woman realized that something was clearly wrong and her heart squeezed with compassion. Are you alone here?" she asked again, trying to figure out where her escort might be. Kira nodded, holding back tears, her face a mixture of fear and shame that she had been experiencing all these minutes. The woman decided not to waste any time and immediately pulled out her phone to call the police, reporting the child who, for some unbelievable reason, had found herself alone on an empty road. By the time the police arrived, several cars had gathered on the road. Their drivers stopped, amazed and concerned by the strange situation. People got out of their cars, exchanging worried glances and looking puzzled at Kira, who stood on the side of the road, surrounded by adults but still feeling terribly alone and frightened. One eyewitness, an elderly man who had pulled up in his older car, addressed the others loudly and indignantly. "Who would leave a child here alone? What kind of people would do that?" The woman who first saw Kira shook her head, barely holding back tears. "I mean, she's just a little girl, and so scared. She could barely speak when I stopped." The police, interviewing eyewitnesses, took turns approaching Kira to hear her version of events. She recounted how the school bus driver first said many hurtful words to her and then literally pushed her into the road, ignoring her pleas. Her voice was shaking, and every word sounded painful and uncertain, but what she said shook everyone around her. One of the policemen, hearing her words, involuntarily clenched his fists. The girl's story, her account of how the driver deliberately humiliated her and forced her to get out, leaving her on the road, caused a real shock. "It's just awful," a woman in the crowd muttered, shaking her head in shock. What kind of person would do that to a child? By this point, the police had started to find out more details. They contacted the school to find out who was driving the bus and why the girl was alone. People around them continued to share their impressions, each adding something new about Kira's condition: her frightened face, crying eyes, trembling hands. While the police were gathering information, the eyewitnesses supported Kira, trying to comfort her, but also unable to hide their outrage. Word of what had happened quickly began to spread, and everyone present felt the need to tell their acquaintances about the blatant incident they had witnessed on the road. As the police passed the information to the school and began gathering information, word of what had happened to Kira spread quickly through the city. The story took on alarming proportions, and everyone who heard it was shocked and shaken to the core. Social media instantly filled with posts about what had happened, and people shared the news, expressing outrage and support for the girl. Parents of children who also traveled on this bus found out about the incident through messages from other parents. In the morning chat room, where they usually discuss class schedules or picking up for activities, suddenly alarmed and angry messages started coming in. "Did you hear what happened to Kira? She was dropped off in the middle of the road," wrote one of the mothers, barely able to cope with her emotions. "The driver just kicked her off the bus like it was normal. That's impossible. How can you leave a child alone on the road? And this is a school driver?" another mother responded. Questions and outrage comments began to mount. Parents could not believe that a person trusted with their children's safety could behave so cruelly and ruthlessly. Many of them began to call each other, discussing the urgency of getting together and demanding explanations from the school and the transportation company. Meanwhile, the story reached the local news. Local journalists, having learned about the egregious case, immediately joined the dissemination of information, and the websites of news outlets began to publish articles with headlines that did not leave any reader indifferent. School bus driver dropped off a girl in the middle of the road. Shocking incident in school transportation. Where are the limits of what is acceptable? People commented on the articles, expressing their anger and demanding justice. Parents of the children who were on the bus also began to receive disturbing messages from their children recounting what they had seen. Many of these children were still reeling from the experience, unable to forget how the driver treated their classmate like a tyrant and pushed her off the bus. Parents could hear the fear and confusion in their children's voices, and this only made them angrier. That same evening, several parents gathered outside the school. The group, initially consisting of a few people, grew every hour, and soon a real rally gathered outside the school. They demanded a meeting with the principal and representatives of the transportation company to get to the bottom of what had happened. People held placards reading "Justice for Kira," "Protecting our children first," and "No racism in our schools." Everyone present felt obliged to defend the rights of their child and the rights of Kira. The mother of one of the children on the bus spoke at the rally. "My son came home scared and silent," she said, struggling to hold back tears. "When I asked him what happened, all he could say was, 'The driver kicked Kira out. He doesn't understand why it happened, and neither do I.' How can you entrust your children to a man capable of such cruelty?" Her words sparked a storm of outrage. Other parents also shared stories of how their children came home depressed and frightened. They said that their children were still in a state of shock and were afraid that the same thing could happen to them. Social networks became an important channel for disseminating information, and soon concerned citizens of the city joined the situation. Many people posted posts calling for the situation to be sorted out, and not only the driver to be brought to justice, but also all those who allowed such a person to work with children. The city was divided, and every conversation in a cafe, at work, or in a store came down to a discussion of this shocking news. People shared the news, were outraged, and actively discussed what they could do to prevent this from happening again. The school, feeling the mounting pressure, issued an official statement. In it, they expressed regret over the incident and said the driver has been suspended and the incident is being thoroughly investigated. However, This statement only fueled the public's anger. Parents did not want a suspension, but a complete exclusion of such a person from the system that is responsible for the safety of children. The city community started to plan further actions. Parents, teachers, activists, and concerned citizens agreed to hold a meeting to discuss the problem of safety in school transportation and develop requirements to improve the system of control over drivers. A petition demanding justice for Kira and tougher measures to protect children appeared on the internet. Signatures on the petition grew in number, and the public outcry spread even to neighboring towns. This case united people, made them realize that no one is immune from injustice and cruelty, and that the protection of children is a shared responsibility of all adults. The morning after the incident, the school administration was already on high alert. The principal and school officials received countless messages and calls from parents demanding immediate intervention. The complaints continued unabated. Outraged mothers and fathers demanding justice for Kira and an explanation as to why the school bus had become a place of such terrible humiliation and danger for the child. The school principal, Mr. Hansen, called an emergency meeting to which the school board members, representatives of the transport company, and the driver himself were invited. When the driver entered the office, he was greeted by the grim faces of the administration and the transportation company's management, who clearly expected an explanation. He did not, however, look embarrassed or remorseful. On the contrary, his face was firm, as if he was sure he was right and thought all the noise around him was unjustified. "I need to understand what you've done," Mr. Hansen began restrainedly, staring intently at the driver. "Tell me what happened, and what made you leave the girl alone in the middle of the road?" The driver grinned a little, and as if justifying himself, shrugged his shoulders. "She's been behaving indecently. I had to warn her several times, but she just ignored my remarks," he said, not meeting the director's gaze. "Children should obey the driver. If someone doesn't understand that, you have to take action." She showed total disrespect. The members of the administration exchanged incredulous glances. They found it hard to believe that the girl could be so rude as to warrant such an act. But the driver, noticing their reactions, continued his excuses without showing the slightest regret. "You know," he said, this time with a more aggressive tone, "I have to deal with discipline on this bus every day. Some kids just don't understand their place. They think they're allowed everything, and she was one of them. I did it for the sake of order." Mr. Hansen squinted perplexedly. "You've decided that order means kicking a child to the side of the road, leaving her alone without help?" he asked, not hiding his displeasure. "Didn't you think about her safety?" "I'm a driver, not a babysitter," the man replied irritably. "I don't have to babysit every child who refuses to behave. I have responsibilities and I fulfill them." His indifference shocked those present, and the atmosphere in the office became even more tense. Even the representatives of the transportation company, who until that moment had tried to keep their opinions to themselves, looked worried. They realized that the driver's words reflected a complete lack of responsibility and could lead to serious consequences. One of the transport company representatives, Mr. Ferguson, frowning, asked, "Why do you think the girl behaved the way you say she did? And how did you try to address this situation before making such an extreme decision?" The driver hesitated for a moment, but then seemed to decide to act more aggressively. "Some kids just don't have discipline, that's all," he replied sharply. "Some of them, how can I put it, think they're allowed more than the rest of us. I'm not going to tolerate being treated without respect. And if you want me to keep working, then I need to be able to set things in order as I see fit." His excuses sounded increasingly violent, and those present began to realize that the driver was probably just trying to shift the blame onto Kira, defending his actions. However, they could not allow such a person to remain in a school working with children. Mr. Hansen, Sensing the growing resentment, address the driver again. Understand that your task is not only to get the children to school, but also to ensure their safety, emphasized the director, trying to keep calm. Your words and actions show a complete lack of understanding of this responsibility. And what happened yesterday is not order, it is child abuse. At this, the driver frowned, clearly offended by this tone. I've always done my job the way I thought it should be done, and there's never been a problem before, he replied stubbornly. But if you want to make me look bad, be my guest. I was only doing my job. The administration's patience was at an end, but they decided to continue the proceedings and question other witnesses. The police officers, who were also present at the meeting, provided eyewitness testimonies that confirmed that the driver had threatened the girl and was openly hostile. Kira's words and her frightened account of what she had been through were corroborated by the testimonies of other children on the bus. We can't ignore the fact that a child has been subjected to such abuse, Mr. Hansen said, looking at the transport company representative. We need assurances that this will not happen again. We can't have this man around children. The driver, seeing the situation turning against him, frowned and tried one last lunge. You don't even know how much discipline these kids lack. They'll behave in any way they want if you don't show them boundaries. I didn't do anything wrong. I just showed them they can't do anything. But his words no longer carried any weight. The school, realizing that it needed to take drastic measures to preserve its reputation and the safety of its students, agreed to suspend the driver while the investigation took place. Parents and the public, upon learning of this decision, demanded a full dismissal, convinced that this man should no longer be working with children. Mr. Hansen, understanding the importance of justice and protecting children, promised that the investigation would be followed through, and that the school would do everything possible to prevent similar incidents in the future. Shortly after the school's decision to suspend the driver pending the outcome of the investigation, public outrage reached a boiling point. Every day, more and more people learned the details of this shocking incident, and the outrage continued to grow. The public, shocked by the cruelty and indifference of the driver, could not stay away. A town that had previously lived a quiet life was shaken up. People could not believe that something so unfair and disgusting could have happened in their community, especially to a child. Parents of school children, community activists, and concerned citizens organized an impromptu meeting in the city's central square to discuss their actions. Local leaders and activists suggested starting a series of protests to express disagreement with what had happened and to demand justice for Kira. Soon leaflets were circulating around the city calling for participation in the protest against discrimination, and social media was flooded with messages of support for Kira and her family. On the day of the first protest, the central square was filled with people who came to express their anger and solidarity with the girl's family. Participants held placards with inscriptions: "Justice for Kira," "No to racism in schools," "Our children deserve safety," and "We are against cruelty and discrimination." In the center of the square, someone set up a makeshift booth with Kira's picture and words of support, where anyone could leave a note or sign a petition in support of her family. The protest continued for several days in a row. At each new meeting, the crowd grew larger and larger, with people from neighboring towns joining them, as well as representatives of human rights organizations who learned about the incident through social media. Local journalists closely covered the events, interviewing participants and publishing articles emphasizing the importance of a fair investigation. Many of the interviewees spoke openly about how the incident revealed deep problems in the school transportation system and in society as a whole. One of the protests featured Kira's mother, who, barely holding back tears, spoke about what her daughter was going through. She shared with the crowd that Kira still couldn't sleep well, constantly waking up in the middle of the night with fear and panic. Her voice shook as she spoke. "I never thought my child could face such injustice. She was just left alone as if she was worthless. I want those responsible to be punished as they deserve. And not just the person who did it, but everyone who allowed such a person to work with children." Her words caused a storm of applause and shouts of support. People shouted, "Justice for Kira," and "Safety for our children." The crowd was united in one accord, and everyone present felt that they had come here for a reason. They felt they were part of something important, part of the fight for the truth and safety of their children. Students who attended the protest with their parents also felt that this moment was important to them. Some teenagers took up placards and stood in the front row with adults to protest injustice. For them, this was not just a demonstration. It was a lesson that they have the right to demand justice and fight for their rights. Local human rights organizations also joined the movement, issuing official statements and providing legal support to Kira's family. They openly condemned the driver's behavior and demanded immediate action from the school and the transportation company to revise their policies on the selection and training of staff working with children. Soon, signatures began to be collected around the city on a petition demanding not just that the driver be suspended, but that he be permanently barred from working with children. At one gathering, a local activist named Mark Rivera, known for fighting for minority rights, took the floor. He addressed the crowd in a loud voice. "We cannot turn a blind eye to this. If we let this happen without consequences, it could happen to any of our children tomorrow. We must protect our children. We must make sure that no one has the right to humiliate them or leave them alone as if they mean nothing." His words resonated in the hearts of those present, and many began chanting slogans demanding immediate action from the school and the transportation company. In response to mounting public pressure and the threat of reputational damage, the school administration was forced to organize another meeting to which they invited representatives of the transport company, parents, human rights organizations, and even local officials. This meeting, held in the school's auditorium, was attended by so many people that some had to stand against the walls to hear the discussion. Local media broadcast the meeting live, and thousands of citizens watched what was happening. During the meeting, representatives of the school and the transport company tried to explain that they had already started an investigation and were ready to cooperate with human rights organizations. But the public did not want to hear empty promises. People demanded concrete action, the driver's dismissal, and the introduction of new safety measures for children. One of the mothers who took the microphone at the meeting stood in front of the audience and said, "We cannot allow our children to be abused and the perpetrators to get away with it. Our children deserve to be protected, and we will stand firm until the perpetrators are punished." Her presentation drew a flurry of applause, and the meeting ended with school and transportation company officials promising to immediately suspend the driver and review their hiring and training practices. Amid growing public pressure and protests, the city authorities realized that it was no longer possible to ignore the incident. Outrage among the city's residents reached a critical point, and in order to calm the public, the mayor's office initiated an official investigation to establish all the details of the incident and determine what measures should be taken. It was decided to create a special commission, which included representatives of the Department of Education, lawyers, psychologists, representatives of parents' committees, and even several human rights activists representing the interests of Kira and her family. The commission began its work immediately. They first examined the numerous testimonies of children and parents that had been collected by the police on the day of the accident, as well as statements from adults who had seen Kira left alone on the road. Parents, school officials, and representatives from the transportation company were invited to attend committee meetings to testify and share their versions of events. During these meetings, eyewitnesses repeatedly described Karina's confusion and fright, emphasizing that the girl had experienced serious psychological trauma. One of the commission's first decisions was to suspend the driver during the investigation. Authorities realized that even a suspension was only a first step, but it was necessary in order to protect other children and reduce public outrage. The driver was summoned to the transportation company's office, where he was told he was temporarily banned from working with children. The man tried to express his displeasure, claiming that he had been suspended without just cause, but the management of the transportation company and the lawyers who advised the commission made it clear that this was a forced decision in light of the situation. The investigation also included a review of the driver's work history. The commission requested information about his previous work experience, his treatment of children, and any possible complaints he may have received in the past. It quickly became clear that he had already been complained about by parents in the past for being rude to children, but those complaints had not been thoroughly investigated. The driver was simply reprimanded and told to be gentler, and then left in his previous position. This information only increased public anger. Many city residents were stunned that a man with such characteristics continued to work in the school system. The board decided to conduct separate interviews with other school transportation drivers that might shed light on the suspended driver's professional behavior. Several of them mentioned that they had noticed his temper and irritability. One driver who used to work with him on the same route said, "He was always stern and often complained about the children. Sometimes he even said that they were too loose. We all thought it was just words, but after what happened, you begin to perceive his behavior differently." Child psychologists were also consulted to help assess what steps needed to be taken to support Kira and other children who had witnessed the incident. The psychologists expressed concern about Kira's condition and warned that the humiliation and fear experienced could leave a deep imprint on her psyche. It was suggested that the girl be provided with psychological support and therapy to help her cope with the effects of this traumatic experience. The commission also ordered the school and the transportation company to review their driver hiring policies and implement stricter selection criteria. At the meetings, questions were raised about the introduction of programs to train drivers to interact with children and manage conflict situations. The decision to include these requirements in the recommendations for all educational institutions of the city was made unanimously. Realizing that disciplinary measures alone will not do the trick, the city authorities also decided to introduce mandatory periodic monitoring of drivers' work. The commission recommended regular anonymous surveys among parents and children to identify potential problems before they become a crisis. The measure was aimed at ensuring transparency and safety in school transportation so that something like this does not happen again. Authorities have publicly announced an investigation and suspension of the driver. The City Hall press office released a statement saying, "City officials are deeply concerned about what happened and believe it is important to protect all school children from similar incidents in the future. We are committed to conducting a full investigation and taking action to ensure the safety of children." However, many city residents felt that these steps were not enough. Protests in the streets continued. People demanded not just a suspension, but the driver's complete dismissal and legal prosecution for actions that jeopardized the life and safety of a child. Parents continued to gather in front of the city hall and the school, holding placards and chanting slogans, calling on the authorities to take decisive action. The mayor, realizing the importance of public opinion, personally met with the parents who came to express their demands. He assured them that the investigation would be conducted objectively and without bias. Kira's parents were also present at the meeting, and the mayor publicly apologized to them for what had happened, promising that those responsible would be given the punishment they deserved. This suspension and the launch of an investigation showed that the community is not going to stand by when it comes to safety and justice for their children. A few weeks after the incident, journalists managed to interview Kira and her family. They invited the reporter into the house, where the atmosphere was saturated with anxiety and tension. Kira's parents, anxious and tired, shared how difficult this period had been for their daughter. Kira's mother, holding back tears, said that her girl could no longer get on the bus safely and went to school every morning with fear. She has become withdrawn, afraid to be alone, the mother shared. Sometimes she wakes up at night and screams. We just don't know how to help her forget this horror. Kira, who sat next to her parents, was silent most of the time, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. I just don't understand why he did that to me. I felt like I wasn't human. She admitted that she still has nightmares about the moment when the driver pushed her to the side of the road and left her alone. This experience didn't just scare her, it shattered her trust in others. She was afraid that she would be humiliated again, that at any moment the world around her could become hostile. Kira's father, trying to calm his daughter, hugged her tightly and turning to the reporter said, "We want everyone to understand that no one has the right to hurt a child. Our Kira doesn't deserve this, and we will fight for her so she can feel safe again." Kira's story was a reminder to many families of how fragile a child's soul is and how important it is to protect children from cruelty and injustice. Kira's story, poignant and disturbing, soon traveled beyond the city limits and attracted national media attention. Reports about the incident began to appear on mainstream television channels. Articles in major newspapers described the details of her experience, and as the incident became known to a wider audience, public condemnation grew. Kira's case became a real symbol, resonating deeply with society. People began to discuss discrimination, equality, and child protection in schools, and the need to protect the most vulnerable. Many prominent anti-racism and anti-discrimination activists publicly supported Kira and her family. Hashtags such as Justice for Kira and Daesh Children Without Racism appeared on social media, with thousands of people expressing their solidarity and demanding serious changes in the education system. The incident galvanized the cultural community. Artists, musicians, and writers inspired by Kira's story created works to protest injustice and the need to overcome discrimination. At the national level, actions and rallies were organized in support of Kira and against all forms of racism in educational institutions. In some schools, teachers and students organized theme days, discussing tolerance, diversity, and children's rights, and the importance of showing kindness and respect to everyone. This case was a starting point for conversations about racism and the need to combat it in every corner of the country. The authorities, under public pressure, began to review the rules and protocols governing the behavior of school staff and tightened the requirements for the selection of drivers and other workers whose work directly involves children. Ultimately, Kira's story led to a nationwide conversation about the need for schools where every child feels protected, regardless of his or her background. Following the Kira incident and a strong public outcry, authorities and educational institutions realized the need for major changes. Reforms were adopted at local and national levels to combat discrimination and ensure the safety of all children. Schools have implemented programs to promote tolerance and respect for diversity. Teachers and staff have received special training in preventing and recognizing discrimination. Regular discussions with pupils about the importance of mutual respect and support have been organized. Transportation companies have revised their hiring standards. School bus drivers are now required to undergo rigorous background checks, including mental toughness assessments and training in ethical behavior. Strict rules and protocols have been put in place to ensure that every child is safe and treated with respect. Society has become more aware and intolerant of any manifestation of racism. Kira's story served as a reminder that indifference is unacceptable. People began to actively participate in movements for equality and justice, organizing events and campaigns against discrimination. Kira and her family received a wide range of support. Through therapy and the support of loved ones, the girl gradually overcame her trauma. She has become a symbol of resilience and inspiration to many. Her story has gone down in textbooks as an example of how one event can be the beginning of a big change. In the end, the tragic incident led to positive changes in society. People realized the importance of confronting injustice and the need to protect the rights of every human being. Kira's story reminded everyone that only together, with compassion and respect, can we create a better future for all. Dear viewers, we are very interested in your opinion. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced injustice or discrimination? Share your experiences in the comments. Each of your feedback is incredibly valuable to us. We are grateful to each and every one of you for staying with us and supporting this channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to click the subscribe button and like this video. It helps us tell more of these important stories. We wish you a good day, and may there be more justice and kindness in the world. Thank you for being with us.